The world knew Ace Frehley as the Space Ace, the silver-faced guitar hero who shot rockets from his Les Paul and made stadiums explode with pyrotechnics. But as the stage lights dimmed after 5 decades of rock and roll, one man sat alone in his Connecticut home, surrounded by guitars and gold records, asking himself a question that haunted him every single night. What would remain when the makeup finally came off for good? The answer, hidden in unreleased recordings and unfinished projects, would shake everything fans thought they knew about the man behind the silver star. Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear changes the entire narrative of Ace Frehley's legacy. Paul Daniel Frehley never planned to become an icon. Born in the Bronx in 1951, he was just another working-class kid who fell in love with the guitar, spending countless hours in his bedroom mastering blues licks and rock riffs, while his neighbors complained about the noise. The transformation from Paul to Ace happened gradually, but the transformation from Ace to Space Ace, that cosmic character with silver makeup and platform boots who would define an entire era of rock music, happened almost by accident. When Kiss formed in 1973, nobody could have predicted that 4 guys in makeup would revolutionize the music industry, and nobody, least of all Ace himself, could have imagined that the character he created would eventually eclipse the man entirely. The Space Ace persona was born from necessity and creativity in equal measure. Gene Simmons had his demon, Paul Stanley had his star child, Peter Criss had his cat, and Ace, well, Ace looked at the stars and decided he wanted to be something otherworldly, something untouchable, something that could shoot lasers and breathe smoke and make teenage kids believe in magic again. But here's what the history books don't tell you, and what Ace himself would only admit decades later in private conversations that were never meant to be public. Creating Space Ace was the easiest part. Living as Space Ace while trying to remain Paul Daniel Frehley was the impossible part. Every night, he would sit in front of that mirror, applying that silver makeup in careful practiced strokes, watching his own face disappear beneath the character, and with each show, with each tour, with each magazine cover and poster and action figure, a little more of the real Ace Frehley vanished into the cosmic void. The 1970s were a blur of success that most musicians could only dream about. Kiss conquered America and then the world, selling out arenas from New York to Tokyo, moving millions of albums, creating a merchandising empire that turned rock bands into brands and musicians into products. Ace's guitar work on albums like Alive, Destroyer, and Love Gun became legendary. His bluesy, melodic solos cutting through the bombast and theatrics with a rawness that reminded everyone these weren't just cartoon characters. These were real musicians with real talent. But behind the triumph, behind the platinum records, and the screaming fans, and the pyrotechnics that lit up Madison Square Garden like the 4th of July, Ace Frehley was drowning. The alcohol started as a way to calm the nerves before shows. Then it became a way to celebrate after shows. Then it became a way to get through the day. And then it just became the way. Nobody in Kiss wanted to acknowledge what was happening, because acknowledging it meant confronting the reality that their cosmic spaceman was falling apart in real time. 1978 should have been Ace's crowning achievement. When Kiss decided that each member would release a solo album on the same day, it was supposed to be a democratic gesture, a way to showcase each member's individual talents while maintaining the collective brand. Gene Simmons expected his album to dominate. Paul Stanley was confident his would sell the most, and nobody, absolutely nobody, predicted that Ace Frehley's album would become the runaway success. New York Groove, a cover of a 1975 Hello song, became a genuine hit, climbing the charts and getting radio play that the other Kiss solo albums could only dream about. For Ace, it was validation, proof that he didn't need the makeup, didn't need the group, didn't need Gene and Paul's controlling influence to create something people loved. But for Kiss, for the carefully constructed machine that Gene and Paul had built, Ace's success was a threat, an existential crisis that revealed a terrifying truth. The spacemen could fly alone. What happened after the solo albums is where the official Kiss story and the real story diverge dramatically. The public narrative says Ace became increasingly unreliable, that his substance abuse made him difficult to work with, that he missed recording sessions and showed up late to concerts and eventually became impossible to manage. That narrative is true, but it's also incomplete, because it ignores what was happening behind the scenes. The power struggles and creative conflicts and personal betrayals that pushed Ace to the edge. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had always been the driving force behind Kiss. The businessmen who understood that rock and roll wasn't just about music. It was about branding and marketing and controlling every aspect of the machine. Ace and Peter, on the other hand, were musicians first. Artists who wanted to play their instruments and write their songs and not worry about action figures and lunchboxes and corporate sponsorships. The tension had always been there, simmering beneath the surface. But after the solo albums, after Ace proved he could succeed without them, it exploded. Recording sessions for Dynasty in 1979 became battlegrounds, with Ace showing up less and less, his parts sometimes played by session musicians, his creative input diminished to the point of irrelevance. The album marked Kiss's controversial turn toward disco with I Was Made for Loving You, a decision that Ace vocally opposed, and one that represented everything he hated about the direction the band was taking. This wasn't rock and roll anymore. This was commerce. This was selling out. This was betraying everything they'd built together. But Gene and Paul didn't care what Ace thought, because they'd already made the calculation. Kiss was bigger than any individual member, including the Space Ace. By 1980, Ace Frehley was barely holding on. The Unmasked album featured even less of his guitar work, and during the tour supporting it, there were nights when he could barely stand, let alone play. The 1980 Albany concert became legendary among Kiss fans, but not for the right reasons. That night, in front of 50,000 people, Ace's hands shook so badly that he could barely grip his Les Paul's neck. Paul Stanley watched from stage left, frozen in disbelief as their lead guitarist fumbled through solos that he'd played perfectly 1,000 times before. Gene Simmons was furious, not because he cared about Ace's well-being, but because it was affecting the show, affecting the brand, affecting the bottom line. After that concert, after the humiliation and the backstage confrontation and the ultimatums that were delivered in harsh, unforgiving tones, Ace knew something had to change. The music from the Elder album sessions in 1981 were supposed to be Kiss's progressive rock masterpiece, their attempt at artistic legitimacy, but for Ace, they were torture. He contributed to only a handful of tracks, his parts mostly recorded by session guitarist Bob Kulick, while Ace was either absent or too impaired to play. The album bombed commercially, and Gene and Paul blamed everyone except themselves. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Kiss had lost its way, and Ace had lost himself. The guitarist who once made stadiums erupt with three-note riffs and bluesy bends was now a shell, going through the motions, collecting paychecks, and waiting for the inevitable end. 1982 was the year everything fell apart. The Creatures of the Night album was recorded almost entirely without Ace, though his face still appeared on the cover, a ghost haunting a band that had already moved on without him. The decision to leave Kiss wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was slow and painful, like watching a relationship die over months of silent dinners and separate bedrooms. Ace's final official concert with Kiss was in December of 1982, though he'd effectively checked out months earlier. The moment he took off that silver makeup for the last time, knowing he wouldn't put it on again as a member of Kiss, was simultaneously the most liberating and most terrifying moment of his life. He was free, but he was also lost. A spaceman without a ship, a character without a stage, a guitarist without a band. What nobody understood at the time, what even Ace himself didn't fully comprehend until years later, was that leaving Kiss wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of the real one. The Space Ace had been a prison disguised as a costume, and stepping out of that prison meant confronting Paul Daniel Frehley, the man he'd been running from since 1973. The addiction didn't magically disappear when he left the band. If anything, it got worse in those early years. Without the structure of Kiss, without the tours and the recording sessions and the obligations that forced him to function at some minimal level, Ace spiraled. Friends from that era remember him as a ghost, living in his Connecticut house, surrounded by gold records that meant nothing, playing guitar alone in the middle of the night, trying to remember who he was before the makeup. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, where the narrative of Ace Frehley as a tragic cautionary tale transforms into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. In 1987, Ace formed Frehley's Comet, a band that was entirely his own, unburdened by the Kiss legacy or Gene and Paul's controlling influence. The band's self-titled debut album, released in 1987, was a revelation. It featured Rock Soldiers, a song that directly addressed Ace's struggles with substance abuse, and it proved that the spaceman still had something to say, still had music inside him that needed to come out. Critics who'd written him off as a washed-up ex-Kiss member had to reconsider, and fans who'd watched him disintegrate during his final Kiss years saw glimpses of the guitarist they'd fallen in love with. Frehley's Comet wasn't a commercial juggernaut like Kiss, but it was something more valuable. It was honest. For the first time in over a decade, Ace was making music on his own terms, writing songs that reflected his experiences rather than fitting into someone else's concept. The band released 2 more albums, Second Sighting in 1988 and Trouble Walkin' in 1989, each one showcasing Ace's growth as a songwriter and bandleader. He was learning, slowly and painfully, how to be Ace Frehley the musician instead of Space Ace the character. The process wasn't smooth. There were relapses and setbacks and moments when it seemed like he might slide back into the darkness. But he kept playing, kept writing, kept pushing forward. When Kiss announced their reunion tour in 1996, with the original lineup back in full makeup, the rock world lost its collective mind. For fans who'd grown up in the 70s, it was a dream come true. A chance to see the band they'd worshipped in their youth, exactly as they remembered them. For Ace, it was more complicated. The official story says he rejoined because he missed his bandmates, because he wanted to give fans what they wanted, because it felt like unfinished business. The real story involves bankruptcy, desperation, and a contract that essentially made him an employee of the brand he'd helped create. By the mid-90s, Ace's financial situation was dire. Years of addiction, mismanagement, and reckless spending had left him broke. When the reunion offer came, it wasn't just attractive, It was necessary. But the terms were harsh. Gene and Paul, who now controlled the Kiss Corporation, made sure the contracts reflected the new power dynamic. Ace and Peter weren't partners anymore. They were hired guns, nostalgia acts brought back to sell tickets and merchandise. The makeup went back on, the costume fit again, and Space Ace returned to arenas around the world. From the audience's perspective, it was magic, the original Kiss back together, better than ever. From Ace's perspective, it was a gilded cage, financial security in exchange for creative autonomy, stability in exchange for his soul. The reunion tours from 1996 to 2001 were massively successful, grossing hundreds of millions of dollars and re-establishing Kiss as a touring powerhouse. Ace played the part perfectly, hitting his marks, delivering his solos, smiling behind the silver makeup. But backstage, the old tensions resurfaced immediately. Gene and Paul still called the shots, still made every creative decision, still treated Ace and Peter as supporting players rather than founding members. The control that Ace had fought so hard to escape in the 80s was back, more suffocating than ever because now he needed it. Needed the money, needed the platform, needed to prove he could still do it. By 2001, Ace had enough. He'd rebuilt his finances, paid off his debts, and most importantly, he'd maintained his sobriety through the grueling tour schedule. He didn't need Kiss anymore, not the way he had in 1996. When he left the band for the second time, it was on his terms, a conscious decision to prioritize his health and happiness over money and fame. The Space Ace costume came off again, and this time, Ace swore it would be for good. He'd given Kiss 2 separate decades of his life, worn that makeup on thousands of stages, played those songs until his fingers bled. It was enough. It had to be enough. What happened next is where Ace Frehley's story becomes truly fascinating, and where the question of his legacy gets complicated. In the 2000s and 2010s, Ace released a series of solo albums that many critics and fans consider his best work. Anomaly in 2009, Space Invader in 2014, Origins Volume 1 in 2016, and Spaceman in 2018. These albums featured guest appearances from Slash, Lita Ford, and other rock legends. But more importantly, they featured Ace at his most authentic, writing songs about his life, his struggles, his victories, and his regrets. Without the filter of a character or the constraints of a corporate brand. Anomaly, his first solo album in 20 years, debuted in the Billboard Top 40 and received the best reviews of his career. Critics praised his guitar work as sharp and inspired, his songwriting as mature and reflective. Space Invader, released when Ace was 63 years old, proved that age hadn't diminished his abilities. If anything, it had refined them. The title track was vintage Ace Frehley, a riff-heavy rocker with his signature melodic touch, while songs like Immortal Pleasure showed a depth and complexity that his Kiss work rarely allowed. For fans who'd followed his journey, these albums were validation, proof that leaving Kiss wasn't the end of his musical story, but the beginning of its most interesting chapter. But here's where the narrative takes its final, most intriguing turn. In 2018, during interviews promoting Spaceman, Ace began dropping hints about unreleased material, about songs he'd recorded over the decades that had never seen the light of day, about projects he'd started but never finished, about a musical legacy that extended far beyond what the public had heard. He talked about studio sessions from the 80s that had been abandoned, demos from the 90s that had been shelved, and most tantalizingly, recent recordings that he'd made but wasn't sure he'd ever release. For his most devoted fans, these hints were maddening. How much music was sitting in vaults? What secrets did those recordings contain? And most importantly, would the world ever get to hear them? The answer to that question involves a complex mix of legal issues, personal reluctance, and the weight of legacy. Some of the unreleased material features other KISS members and is therefore tied up in the legal labyrinth of KISS Corporation ownership and rights. Some of it is from Ace's darkest periods, recordings made when he was at his lowest, and he's not sure he wants the world to hear him in that state. Some of it is simply unfinished, ideas that never quite came together, riffs without songs, songs without endings. But according to people close to Ace, there's also material that's complete, polished, and potentially career-defining. Music that he's held back for reasons even he can't fully articulate. In 2021, during the pandemic lockdown, Ace spent months in his home studio, going through decades of archives, listening to old recordings, rediscovering songs he'd forgotten he'd written. He posted cryptic messages on social media about going through the vaults and finding treasures, fueling speculation among fans that a major archival release was coming. But as of now, years later, most of that material remains unreleased. When asked about it in interviews, Ace becomes evasive, saying things like, "Maybe someday," or "We'll see," or "The timing has to be right." It's frustrating for fans, but it also reveals something profound about Ace Frehley's relationship with his own legacy. Understanding why Ace holds back this material requires understanding what it represents. For 5 decades, Ace Frehley has been defined by other people's narratives. Gene and Paul's story of KISS, the media's story of the troubled rock star, the fans' story of the Space Ace comeback. The unreleased recordings are his, and his alone. They represent creative freedom in its purest form, music made without commercial pressure or corporate oversight or fan expectations. Releasing them means subjecting them to the same scrutiny, the same judgment, the same machinery that he spent his entire post-KISS career trying to escape. There's also the question of how he wants to be remembered. Right now, Ace's legacy is complex, but generally positive. He's a guitar hero who helped define an era, a musician who overcame addiction and personal demons, an artist who proved he could succeed outside of KISS. The unreleased material, depending on what it contains, could complicate that narrative. If the recordings from his darkest periods reveal just how far he'd fallen, do fans need to hear that? If the recent material shows him struggling with age or diminished abilities, does that serve his legacy or damage it? These are questions Ace grapples with, questions that keep those recordings locked away. But there's another interpretation, one that's more hopeful and perhaps more accurate. Maybe Ace keeps creating, keeps recording, keeps pushing forward not because he's worried about his legacy, but because he's finally free from worrying about it. The Space Ace character was all about legacy, about being iconic and memorable and larger than life. Paul Daniel Frehley, the man behind the makeup, is just a musician who loves playing guitar. If the songs never get released, if the recordings stay in the vault, maybe that's okay. Maybe the act of creating them, of expressing himself through music after all these years, is enough. In recent interviews, Ace has become increasingly philosophical about his life and career. He talks about the KISS years with a mix of pride and regret, acknowledging the incredible success while also noting the personal cost. He talks about his solo career with genuine satisfaction, proud of the music he's made on his own terms. And when asked about his legacy, about what he wants people to remember, His answer is surprisingly simple. I just want people to remember that I played guitar and tried to be honest about who I was. The irony of Ace Frehley's story is that his greatest achievement might be the thing that's hardest to quantify or market: authenticity. In an industry built on artifice, where image often matters more than substance and branding trumps artistry, Ace spent 5 decades trying to be real. Sometimes he failed spectacularly, drowning in addiction and losing himself in the character. Sometimes he succeeded quietly, making music that reflected his truth rather than commercial trends. But he never stopped trying, never gave up on the possibility that Paul Daniel Frehley and the Space Ace could somehow coexist, that the man and the myth could find peace. The unreleased recordings, sitting in their vaults and hard drives, represent possibility. Possibility that there's more to the story, more music to be heard, more of Ace Frehley to discover. Whether they ever get released is almost beside the point. Their existence is enough, proof that creativity doesn't stop, that the journey continues even when the stadiums are empty and the makeup is off and the spotlight has moved on to the next generation of guitar heroes. Ace is in his 70s now, still playing, still recording, still wrestling with the same questions about identity and legacy that have haunted him since he first painted that silver star on his face in 1973. In 2022, during an interview that received little mainstream attention but resonated deeply with longtime fans, Ace said something that captures the essence of his entire journey. Space Ace was a character I created, but somewhere along the way, the character started creating me. Took me 40 years to figure out who I really was underneath all that. Turns out I was just a kid from the Bronx who loved playing guitar. Simple as that. It's a remarkable statement from someone who spent decades as one of rock's most iconic figures. A recognition that all the pageantry and theatrics and cosmic mythology were ultimately just window dressing for something pure and uncomplicated: a musician and his instrument. The question of what remains when the makeup comes off has haunted Ace throughout his career. But maybe he's finally found the answer. What remains is the music, the hundreds of songs he's written and recorded, the riffs that inspired generations of guitarists, the solos that made teenagers pick up their first Les Paul. What remains is the journey, the rises and falls and comebacks, the addiction and recovery, the leaving and returning and leaving again. What remains is the honesty, the willingness to show weakness, to admit mistakes, to keep trying even when it would be easier to give up. What remains is Ace Frehley, not Space Ace, just Ace, still here, still playing, still searching. The unreleased recordings might see the light of day someday, or they might not. Future generations might discover them in archives, or they might remain forever locked away, musical secrets that died with their creator. In a way, it doesn't matter. The real legacy of Ace Frehley isn't contained in any specific album or song or performance. It's the totality of the journey, the 5 decades of creation and destruction and recreation, the constant evolution from Paul to Ace to Space Ace and back to Ace again. It's the proof that you can be a cartoon character and a real person, that you can wear a mask for decades and still find your face underneath, that you can lose yourself completely and somehow, against all odds, find your way back home. The silver makeup is packed away now, gathering dust in some storage unit along with platform boots and cosmic costumes and pyrotechnic guitars. The Les Paul, though, that's still within reach, still played almost daily, still capable of producing those signature bends and melodic runs that made Ace Frehley one of rock's most distinctive guitarists. In his Connecticut home studio, Surrounded by decades of equipment and memorabilia and memories, Ace still creates, still records, still chases whatever musical ideas come to him in the middle of the night. Not for Kiss, not for fans, not for critics or record labels or anyone else. Just for himself. Just for the pure joy of making sound, of turning electricity and wood and metal strings into something that moves people. That's Space Ace's final show. Not a farewell tour or a last concert or a grand finale, but an ongoing process of creation that continues regardless of audience or acclaim. The kid from the Bronx who fell in love with guitar never stopped playing, never stopped searching for the next riff, the next song, the next moment of musical transcendence. The fact that the world might never hear some of that music doesn't diminish its importance. It was created, it exists, it mattered to the person who made it. In the end, maybe that's the only legacy that truly counts.